They called it the Garden of Immortality, where golden fountains sang day and night and white peacocks wandered through jasmine groves. But no garden could mask the smell of fear that clung to the daughters who lived inside those walls. In the spring of 473 BC, inside a chamber lit by 1,000 oil lamps, three sisters knelt side by side, their hair braided with sacred herbs, their skin anointed with oils reserved for the dead. The youngest couldn't stop shaking. She was 9 years old enough to understand what the priests were saying, but too young to comprehend why her own father stood watching from the shadows, his eyes hungry in a way that made her stomach turn. Her sisters had told her to stay silent, to breathe through the incense, to let her mind go somewhere else. But there was nowhere else to go. The golden chains around her wrists were real. The marble altar before her was real. The high priest told her this was the highest honor in the empire, that she was chosen by the gods to preserve the divine bloodline. She had heard these words before, whispered by her older sisters who now moved like ghosts through the palace corridors, their eyes empty, their smiles painted on. They used to have different names. They used to laugh. Now they called themselves eternal brides of the God King. The man who orchestrated this wasn't just her father. He was Xerxes I, king of kings, ruler of 50 million souls, the living embodiment of the god Ahura Mazda on earth. But inside these walls, he was something else entirely. A man so terrified of mortality that he had turned his own daughters into experiments in divine breeding, convinced that if he could create a bloodline pure enough, he would live forever through them. Before we expose what Xerxes did to erase his daughter's very identities, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Help this channel grow so we can continue uncovering the crimes that empires tried to bury. Because every subscription is a voice that says, we will not let tyrants hide behind golden monuments and sacred lies. The prophecy that poisoned a dynasty. Xerxes wasn't born a monster. He was born in 519 BC into the most powerful dynasty the world had known. But the seeds of his future crimes were planted when he was just 9 years old. That year, Zoroastrian magi brought his father Darius a terrifying prophecy. The royal bloodline would fall within 3 generations unless drastic measures were taken to preserve its divine purity. The priests presented ancient texts from Egyptian temples describing how pharaohs maintained power through sacred marriage, brother to sister, father to daughter. Not from lust, they claimed, but divine necessity. Darius was horrified and locked the scrolls away, but young Xerxes had been there. The prophecy burned itself into his mind. As Xerxes grew, his education reinforced a dangerous worldview. Zoroastrian priests didn't teach him to be a king among men, they taught him to be a god walking on earth. Every morning began with hymns to his sacred essence. Courtiers prostrated themselves in his presence. By age 20, when he took the throne in 486 BC, Xerxes genuinely believed he was divine. His thoughts were cosmic revelations, his desires were holy. And his fears, especially his fear of death, became theological crises demanding theological solutions. Then came Greece. In 480 BC, Xerxes assembled over 1 million men to conquer the West and cement his godhood forever. When storms destroyed his bridge across the Hellespont, he ordered soldiers to whip the sea 300 times, symbolic punishment for defying divine will. But at Salamis, Greek ships shattered his fleet. At Plataea, his armies were routed. For the first time, the man who called himself immortal tasted defeat, and that's when everything changed. When a god realizes he can bleed, he doesn't become humble, he becomes desperate. Desperate to prove his divinity through the only thing he could still absolutely control, his family. By 478 BC, Xerxes had 14 daughters. The oldest, Amstress the Younger, was 16, brilliant, educated, promised in marriage to a Median prince. Xerxes canceled the marriage without explanation. Instead, he summoned her to the chamber of divine union, a sealed wing reconstructed according to those ancient Egyptian texts his father had locked away. For 3 weeks she was isolated. Zoroastrian priests visited in rotating shifts, reciting the same message. You are the reincarnation of the goddess Anahita. Your union with the King of Kings will birth demigods. Refusing will curse the entire empire. Every child in Persia will suffer because of your selfishness. They gave her narcotic teas that made her thoughts slow and suggestible. They showed her ancient texts, religious approvals, prophecies. When Xerxes finally entered on the night of the full moon, Amstress didn't fight. Drugged and indoctrinated, she consented to her own destruction because she believed she was saving her people. That was the genius of Xerxes' evil. He didn't create victims who hated him. He created victims who thanked him. But the programming wasn't perfect. After the drugs wore off, some daughters began to remember. One, Artaint, age 15, stood up during a public court session and denounced her father in front of 200 nobles. She described what he had done, begged the court to intervene to save her younger sisters. The throne room fell silent. Then Xerxes smiled, embraced her like a confused child, and announced she was suffering from demonic possession. 3 days later, she returned. But she wasn't the same person. She didn't remember her accusations. She loved her father. She was honored to serve him. What Xerxes had developed was systematic memory erasure through controlled trauma. First, complete sensory isolation in underground chambers. No light, no sound, no time. Linear memory fractured within days. Second, powerful hallucinogens that made minds extremely suggestible. Third, identity reconstruction. Priests posing as family members described false childhoods, repeated invented memories hundreds of times. Fourth, pain and comfort cycling, creating traumatic attachment to captors. By the end, the daughter who entered that chamber never came out. What emerged was a construct programmed to defend the system, destroying her. Apollonides, a Greek physician who later escaped, wrote that watching this process was like watching someone die while their body kept walking. Xerxes' obsession deepened. By 475 BC, children had been born from his unions with his daughters, children who were simultaneously his offspring and grandchildren. Rather than recognizing the horror, Xerxes saw success. He implemented Phase 2. These children would be paired with each other or cycled back to him in an ever-tightening spiral of multi-generational incest. Palace physicians kept meticulous records that read like medical horror. Infant mortality reached 70%. Children born from concentrated incest suffered seizures, blindness, skeletal deformities. Many died before age 5. Xerxes called these deaths divine selection, the gods testing the bloodline. Weak children were buried in unmarked chambers beneath the palace, their existence never officially recorded. The children who survived grew up knowing nothing outside the sealed wing. They were taught their family structure was normal, that their deformities were marks of divine favor rather than symptoms of biological collapse. One physician's note is particularly chilling. The king inspected 7 new children today. 3 showed sacred markings, eyes that do not track, skin that bruises easily, minds that cannot form speech. His Majesty was pleased. The 4 children without divine markings were transferred to the lower chambers. The lower chambers meant disposal. Children who appeared too normal were seen as proof the bloodline wasn't pure enough. They were quietly killed. By 470 BC, Xerxes had created something unprecedented. A multi-generational closed breeding loop involving dozens of his descendants. And the empire's elite watched it happen because they profited: new estates, tax exemptions, political favors. Zoroastrian priests blessed the unions, claiming daughters were extensions of the emperor's sacred essence. Court physicians prepared herbal tonics to mask bruises and erase evidence. The older daughters, already broken, became assistants preparing younger ones. Participation was survival. The circle of abuse fed on its own pain, perpetuating itself through fear. Corruption had become the empire's second religion. The conspiracy that ended Xerxes in 465 BC wasn't about justice. It was self-preservation. Artabanus, captain of the royal guard, had witnessed enough. But what triggered the assassination was fear. During a feast, Xerxes publicly announced the purification project would expand to include daughters of noble families, binding them to the divine bloodline forever. The nobles understood immediately. Their daughters would be next. Artabanus gathered 7 officials who had profited from Xerxes' reign but now feared losing everything. They didn't plan to expose him, they planned to erase him. Kill him quietly, install his son Artaxerxes I, and bury every trace. On August 4, 465 BC, they struck through underground tunnels. They found Xerxes alone, preparing for another ritual. Artabanus drove a dagger through his back. The others struck repeatedly. Then they staged it as peaceful death, sudden heart failure. The empire mourned publicly. Those who knew breathed in relief. Artaxerxes I immediately sealed the breeding wing. He couldn't destroy it, too many powerful families had. Children trapped inside. Instead, he let the program continue in extreme secrecy until all adults died naturally, then scattered surviving children across the empire under false identities. For a decade, the horror continued in silence, then it was erased. Participants died. Children scattered, chambers sealed, official histories mentioned nothing. Xerxes was remembered only for failing in Greece, a footnote in Persian history. The conspiracy of silence lasted millennia, until 1935. British archaeologists excavating Persepolis found an underground network of sealed chambers beneath the royal residential complex. Inside were hundreds of skeletal remains, mostly infants and young children showing severe genetic defects and malnutrition. They also discovered administrative archives, clay tablets documenting 40 years of systematic incest involving over 60 descendants, medical records detailing genetic outcomes, schedules for rituals, inventories of narcotics for memory erasure. Everything preserved in bureaucratic detail. Most heartbreaking were tablets hidden in walls, crude, childish prayers to gods begging for death, for mercy, for someone to remember them. Proof that some daughters retained enough of themselves to know they were being destroyed, even if they could never escape. Today, tourists walk through Persepolis marveling at towering columns celebrating imperial glory. Few know what lies beneath. Bones of children born into nightmares disguised as divinity who suffered while an empire looked away. Xerxes didn't just abuse bodies. He colonized minds, rewrote memories, trapped his daughters in psychological prisons so complete they couldn't recognize their own suffering. He turned love into ownership, family into property, religion into a weapon. And he did it with full cooperation of an empire that chose complicity because it was profitable. This is how civilizations collapse, not through invasion, but through moral rot from within, when those with power call atrocities holy. When witnesses choose silence because speaking costs too much. When systems protect monsters rather than victims. If this disturbed you, it should. History isn't just battles, it's forgotten voices crying from beneath palace floors, demanding we remember so we never repeat. Subscribe, hit that like button, and help ensure these voices are never silenced again. Because the moment we stop remembering is the moment we risk becoming the next generation who chose to look away. The daughters of Xerxes deserved better than the empire that sacrificed them.